Hello and welcome to our fifth video for our YouTube series Unity for C#. Today we're going to talk about constructors and destructors, which are now called finalizers, but maybe some of you still know them under the name destructors. A constructor method is a method that is called when an object of a class is initialized. So for example, if I would write a constructor method here in this class dog, if I would now initialize our dog Berno with new dog, round bracket open, round bracket close, this constructor method would be called. A class can have multiple constructor methods which overload each other. You can define a constructor in your class by writing public followed by your exact class name followed by an opening and closing round bracket. Don't forget to start a code block for your method with an opening curly bracket and end it with a closing curly bracket. The constructor method don't need a return type because it doesn't return anything except the object itself. Okay, let's add an attribute of type bool to our class dog and set it false by default. I will call this attribute born. Then we add a parameter of type bool to our constructor method, which we will call isBorn. Now I could write something like born equals isBorn, which would assign the value of our constructor's parameter to our born attribute at our class dog. But what I could also write is this.born equals isBorn. This always stands for the actual class that we are working in right now. The benefit of using the keyword this in this context is that we could give our parameter and our attribute both the same name, which is born, for example. That is working because this.born specifies that we are talking about our attribute born, and if we do an equals born, the compiler recognizes that the second born must be the parameter that we gave to our constructor method in this case. To be honest, I don't like this though, so I'm gonna rename my parameter born to isBorn again, because I prefer when my parameters have different names than my attributes. This makes reading the code for me much easier. If I do it like this, I also don't need to use the keyword this, because the parameter name and the attribute name are different. What we can do as well is calling another class method from our constructor, so I will call the bug method. Or you could also write this.bug, but using this here would be completely unnecessary. The next thing we need to do is fixing the initialization of our object Berno. Because when you write something like new class name, round bracket open, round bracket close, this is calling the constructor of your class. We wrote new dog, round bracket open, round bracket close. But now we added a parameter to our constructor. So now we can't leave the brackets empty, but rather need to fill in a value for this parameter. Let's set this value to true for the moment, and also I need to change the bug method because right now it's only returning woof woof, but we want to print it to the console, so we need to do a debug log woof woof. Okay, so if we save our script now and start the scene in the Unity editor, you can see that it will print woof woof to the console. And it is important for you to notice that the only line that we have in the Unity start method right now is our initialization and declaration of our object Berno from class dog. So only initializing Berno will call the constructor method of class dog, and this will call the bug method, which is defined in class dog, and it will print woof woof to the console. Now I want to show you how to overload a constructor with another constructor. For this example, I will create a constructor that has 0 parameters, and it will set age to 0 and name to standard dog. And now, every time we initialize an object of type dog, the compiler will decide which constructor to use based on how many values we gave our constructor during the initialization of our object. If we initialize our object and give the constructor, for example, 0 values, the compiler will choose the constructor that has 0 parameters. If we will give the constructor 1 value, the compiler will choose the constructor that has 1 parameter. Let's try this with an example. I will initialize our object Berno with 0 values in the constructor, and I will then debug log Berno's name to the console. And if everything would work as expected, we would see standard dog as the name in the console. And that's exactly what happened, and this is because we gave 0 values to our constructor during the initialization, and this will cause the compiler to choose the constructor with 0 parameters. If we put in the value 2 here, then this constructor here which takes one parameter of type bool, would be executed. You can also kind of call a constructor from another constructor, and this is a nice way to overload a constructor that has more parameters than the constructor that you use to overload it. To do this, write colon this, opening round bracket, and then you can add the values that you haven't got with this constructor and you want to add as default values for the constructor that you want to call. So add those values and end with a round closing bracket. So in this example, if you initialize dog with 0 values in your constructor, this constructor here will be called, and this constructor will call the next constructor which uses 1 parameter, and it will choose false as the value for isBorn. And if we execute this, we can see that it will log false to the console, because born is set to false, and it will debug log woof woof as well, so everything works as expected. Now I want to talk about finalizers. I don't want to go too much into detail about finalizers in this video, but I still want to explain the basics of them. So what is a finalizer? A finalizer is a method that is automatically called when you initiate the destruction of your object. The finalizer is called before the object will be given to the garbage collector. You can only define a finalizer for a class, and it cannot be overloaded, it cannot even be called, and it does not take any parameters. Okay, now let's define a finalizer. It's important that you remember to never put public in front of your finalizer. I know I didn't explain the keyword public yet. I will explain this in much more detail in a later video, but for now it's just important that you know that public means that the variable or method is exposed to everything outside that class. And we don't want to expose the finalizer to anything outside that class, because the finalizer can only be called by the garbage collector anyways. To define a finalizer, write a tilde, followed by your exact class name, followed by an opening and closing round bracket, followed by a code block. Inside our finalizer's code block, I will write a debug log statement that says dog died. Remember, this code block will only be called if an object of our class dog will be destroyed. We defined our object Berno in the code block of our start method. This means Berno is only valid or existing in the code block of our start method. This is something that we call scope. I will talk about this in much more detail in one of the newer videos. But for now it's just important that you notice that after the start method code block is ending, Berno will be destroyed. This means we are expecting 3 things in the console. First, it will call the constructor when we create Berno. That means woof woof is the first thing that we should see in the console. After this, we debug log berno.born, which is false, so we should see false in the console. And after this, the start code block ends. If the start code block ends, Berno is not existing anymore, that means it will be destructed. If Berno will be destroyed, that means our finalizer will be called for Berno, and that means the last thing that we should see in the console will be dog died. Okay, let's save this and try this out. And as you can see, this is exactly what we see. Woof woof, false, and then dog died. And that is because first the start method runs out, so we are at the end of the code block of the start method, and then the finalizer will be called. Okay, that's it for this video. I hope you guys liked it and learned something about constructors, overloading constructors, and finalizers. And I will see you soon for the next video. Welcome to the end of this video. Hit the subscribe button to stay updated. Also, if you need some high quality assets for your game or like our channel and want to support us, feel free to check out our assets at the Unity or Unreal Asset Store. You'll find the link to our store pages in the description. I hope you learned something new and see you next time.